I'm Misha here, and it's time for the Apache. It's another helicopter video. Don't get a chance to do a whole lot of these, so always fun to do. And we're going to look at and compare models from Air Force One here and Hobby Master over here. And just to say right off the bat, the Hobby Master is a 172 die-cast, and for some reason, even though the box says 172 die-cast on the Air Force One, it actually is more 164 scale. They goofed. That said, I actually think 164 is pretty great scale for a helicopter like this because it allows more detail. 172 is a wee bit small, but on the other hand it scales with most airplanes, so it's kind of a 6-1, half dozen of another. I originally had bought the Hobby Master a while back, but I picked up this Air Force One from Pete's Collectibles because he had one left and he was just looking to clear out the inventory SKUs, so it made me a real good buy on it. I figured, what the hey, I really do like the Apache. It's also worth noting out that Air Force One calls this an AH-64A, but it seems to at least have some AH-64D Longbow features. Now that said, most original AH-64As were upgraded in service to Ds, so we can just say that it was once an A that was upgraded to a D. How about that? The differences are very minuscule. I mean, not internally, there's huge differences, but the actual outside looks. So, let's just dive in. The whole idea behind the Apache started off in 1972, when in November of that year, the Advanced Attack Helicopter program was launched by the U.S. Army to replace the venerable AH-1 Cobra from Bell. The new advanced helicopter needed to have more firepower, it needed to be more survivable, and have better speed and range than the Cobra. And this was given a priority status in the Army, meaning they wanted it done as quick as possible. Initially, several companies submitted design bids, but in July of '73, it was narrowed down to Bell and Hughes. Designing would continue. In 1975, the Hughes design, known as the Model 77 internally, and designated as the AH-64, it first flew in September 30th of 1975. It was going up against Bell's AH-63. And in the following year, 1976, the Army selected the Hughes design for further development and eventual adoption. They had a few reasons. They thought it was a little more survivable. They liked the landing gear arrangement. They just generally thought it was a more durable, solid design. So after it was selected, they kind of entered phase 2. One of the big things they were testing was the new Hellfire missile, which had been first kind of designed in 1974. So it was kind of developed in combination with the new attack chopper. They also worked on avionics. One of the last changes they did, they uprated the engine in 1981. This is around the same time the name Apache was applied. And then full-scale production was authorized in 1982. And the first production AH-64 Apache rolled out of Hughes factory in 1983. And the first ones were delivered to the Army in '84. And they first became operational in April of 1986. It's worth pointing out that in 1984, McDonnell Douglas purchased Hughes, and absorb them. So actually, by the time these were really in service, they were produced under the McDonnell Douglas name. And they would begin deliveries in the late 80s. The Apache would first see combat during the invasion of Panama in 1989, but of course its first real big claim to fame, and I remember this firsthand, was the Gulf War. In 1990, Operation Desert Shield, they were stationed in Saudi Arabia, and then when Operation Desert Storm kicked off on January 17th of 1991, a squadron of Apaches, I believe it was 8 or so, were charged with taking out a majority of Iraq's radar and communications networks, and proved quite good at that. They kind of paved the way for other aircraft and armor to do their thing. And then they were also used to do what we would consider tank plinking. They took out tanks on the move as well as on the ground, APCs, and so on and so forth. In total, about 277 Apaches were used in the first Gulf War. They had quite a good kill ratio, and only one Apache was destroyed. It was shot down by a surface missile or rocket, I forget. But luckily the crew ejected and survived. And so that was kind of its combat debut on the major screen, and it did well. Some problems did surface, and we'll get to that in the second little bit here, but, you know, for the most part, it performed quite admirably and showed itself to be a marked improvement over the older Cobra. So what do we have here? Well, with the rotors going, front and back, we're at about 58 feet long. The fuselage itself is just under 50 feet. The rotor diameter is about 48 feet. It's not the fastest chopper. The Westland Lynx is faster. It can get up to about 180, 185 miles per hour. It's never supposed to go much over 200, but it really likes to cruise at about 160, 170. It has a maximum ceiling of 21,000 feet, but that's pretty lightly loaded, and that's not this bird's goal. The whole thing was, it was a tank killer. It was an attack helicopter, a dedicated attack helicopter. We have a crew of 2. We have a pilot and a co-pilot / weapons officer or gunner. We do have a real gun for the gunner under the nose here. Don't think we got this little, it does rotate on this model. It's a 30mm chain gun. It has up to 1,200 rounds of ammunition meant to punch through armor. That's pretty mean. We have 4 pylons, 2 under each stub wing, and the longbow would add additional hard points at the edges of the wing. Like I said, this was designed for the Hellfire missile. It could carry up to 16 when fully loaded, or it could carry up to 76 rockets if you had 4 rocket pods. Or, as on most models, including this one here, you have a mix of the 2, with 8 Hellfires and around half that number of rockets. So she is a tank killer. It does have an ejection system for the crew, as I said. It was all-weather, able to operate night and low visibility. It had good armor for being a chopper, and was very advanced for its day and time. But it was not at all perfect. Moving on to the Longbow, and looking now more at the Hobbymaster model. Interestingly, this is the only helicopter that Hobbymaster currently does. They have several versions, different paint schemes. And they do have, it's coming out later this year, the AH-64E Guardian, which is, you know, externally not that different. But yeah, they don't seem to do a lot in the helicopter realm. Well, as early as 1990, it was authorized to have an upgrade plan for the Apache by the government. And really, the AH-64B and AH-64C were planned upgrades between 92 and 93 that were first funded, then cut, and then upgraded. And basically, they were dealing with the avionics, the radar, the communications gear. Most everything proposed in those was wrapped up into the AH-64D and then some. The initial prototype would become this first flew in 1992, and then full production was authorized in 1995, late that year around October. And in March of 97, the first of the new AH-64D Longbows was delivered to the U.S. Army. It's also worth pointing out that later that year, McDonnell Douglas would merge with Boeing, meaning that newer Apaches would now be made under the Boeing name. So now we're on a third manufacturing name for this design. Essentially, the Longbow is this. The dome up here, the sensor dome on top of the rotors. It gave a brand new type of radar, said to be 400% more effective in discerning. It was able to ID up to 128 targets and prioritize up to 16 as, primary threats, targeting them and all that. We had upgrades to the cockpit. We had upgrades to the communications gear. The engines would be upgraded. Essentially just going through the aircraft, updating all the electronics, some of the hardware. They also would upgrade the Longbow to work with the newest generations of Hellfire missiles. And eventually they would also upgrade them where they could work with up to 4 Stinger missiles if needed. So a little more weapons support. We still have our chain gun under the nose. Still have a crew of 2. Not only would they buy brand new AH-64Ds, they would upgrade most of the fleet of the older AH-64As to the 64D standard. So they kind of were doing both. In fact, most 64Ds in service are older A's that were upgraded, although, plenty of brand new ones were purchased. One thing also they did, one fault of the Apache noted in the first Gulf War, it was very maintenance intensive. It required quite a few hours on the ground for every flight hour. So when they went to the Longbow, they did what they could to minimize. So the Longbow versions required less maintenance. They're a little more easy to work with and a little more forgiving and all that. So these would be in service in the late 90s. They would be deployed in Afghanistan. They would also be used extensively in the Second Iraq War, beginning, of course, in March of 2003. They would be used more as a close air support craft, aiding the troops and armor on the ground. Just kind of going out there and taking out Iraqi targets of opportunity. And they would remain in service in those theaters, doing exactly what you'd expect them to be doing ever since. They would initially plan to upgrade 500 of the older 64As, then they would up that to 596, so nearly 600 of the older ones would be upgraded. That was around 2006. By 2010, they had about 757 planned to be in service. And it's kind of worth noting that the last AH-64A was pulled from service in July of 2012 to go back to the Boeing factory to be updated to the 64D. So there are no longer any 64As in American service. Now, some foreign users still have some, but even they are upgrading theirs or retiring them otherwise. And it was actually a pretty easy upgrade process, especially just adding the new radar dome and so on and so forth. In total, Hughes / McDonnell Douglas / Boeing has made around 2,000 of these, with production still officially ongoing, including the new AH-64D Guardian, which I'm not going to talk about in this video because, like I said, Hobbymaster is coming out with the model of that later, so I'll save that for that video. But yeah, kind of America's attack helicopter. And again, it's been used by Japan, and it's been under license there as well as in Britain by Westland. And it's been used by quite a few nations, Israel, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying it hasn't had its issues and problems, but all in all, it's been a relatively successful aircraft, especially for how complicated and advanced it is. So very much flying today, and we'll probably still be flying for a number of years to come. So, brief comparison of these models, aside from the obvious of the Air Force One being a little bigger. I will say that, as I usually point out with Air Force Ones, it does come with this nice metal stand. It's always good. The larger size allows for more detail and just more weight. It does have crew figures, but it's kind of the generic Air Force One crew. It's fine, it's better than nothing, but they're a little bit kind of basic. A little silly. Not bad, though. The gun does rotate. The only problem with mine, and I just need to put a little dab of glue, this right wing is a little loose. It's not going to come off, but it's got a little bit of wiggle to it. And that's an issue I've noticed with Air Force Ones in general. Sometimes you'll get them, and there'll be a loose part here or there. But you can always fix that. On the other hand, the ordnance did come installed on the wings. It's actually good because on my Hobbymaster, the ordnance plugs into such small holes, and because it sticks out so much, it's so easy to get knocked that it did not take long before a couple of them just kind of wore out because it's such a small tab. They didn't break, they just kind of get worn in, and they don't want to stick in as much. So I just took a dab of glue and just put a little dab of glue up in there. I can still, take them off if I really wanted to, but I basically had to glue them in because they would not stay on otherwise. And then once the cats got a hold of them, and miracle of miracles, I found them. But yeah, the ordnance didn't want to stay on. In fact, one of the pylons for the rocket pod actually broke before I could even put it on. Luckily, it was an easy glue back, but I did have a little bit of a headache with the ordnance on the Hobbymaster, so I was fine with the Air Force Ones being attached. On the other hand, the crew figures in the Hobbymaster are much more detailed. They're also removable. The canopy does open. And the gun does move. It's a little stiffer on this one, but it does rotate. It's actually quite a bit stiff, but you can position it. I can't do it one-handed though. The propellers are actually quite a bit smoother. They both spin on both of them, but here you can tell they have some good. And they come already attached. The Air Force One is like a Corgi model where you plug in the propellers, the blades. It's not a big deal. They pop right in. But yeah. And again, they both have metal bodies. And the small details are, of course, the polymer. And they both have wheels. Do they rotate on the Hobbymaster? I don't think they do. Now, the wheels seem to be fixed on the Hobbymaster. They don't rotate. But on the Air Force One, they do rotate. So, I guess that's something. I don't really think it matters, but it might to someone. So the wheels do move on the Air Force One. Of course, it is a slightly bigger scale, making it easier to have articulation like that. Hobbymaster's not real big on articulation, I've noticed. A lot of times the parts don't move. Of course, your tail blades also spin on both of these. So yeah, I thought I would just share Like I said, this is the only helicopter that Hobbymaster does to date. Air Force One does do a few others. They do the Black Hawk, which is maybe my favorite of theirs. They also do the Eurocopter. So they do a few helicopters. Air Force One does some kind of neat stuff, frankly. Stuff that no one else has done. They do a lot of the Chinese planes, too. So it's kind of up to you what you prefer. The Air Force One is a little less detailed, a little more seam lines, a little more exposed screws, but it is cheaper, and it is a bigger scale. And it's a little heavier on the metal department. The Hobbymaster is a little more expensive, a little more detailed, but a little lighter weight because of the smaller scale, and it does use a little more polymer to give you that more detail. So it's up to you which suits you better. Well, I greatly appreciate you tuning in. Any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And definitely go over and check out Pete's Collectibles. He, as far as I know, is out of these now, but he has other things. He does have the, in fact, I kind of forgot to mention, this Apache from Hobbymaster also came from him, and I know he still has those. And if you'd like, you can use product code Misha, M-I-S-H-A, to save 1% and get a good deal on shipping. Well, this is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.